Hello everyone, welcome again to Psychology 346, Social Psychology, and today we're going to be talking about social influence. So we talked about persuasion, and when we talk about persuasion, we're basically talking about trying to convince other people to behave in ways through their own volition, that we're getting them to do things because they want them to do them. And we can think about ways in which not only we can influence people or persuade other people, but in ways which we are influenced ourselves. We can be influenced through persuasion, obviously, but there are other ways in which we can be influenced even just by the mere presence of other people or the specific situations that we might be in. One great example of this is social facilitation. So as humans, we actually tend to perform better when we're surrounded by other people. Specifically, we perform better at behaviors that we're good at. So one way of framing this is the dominant behavior tends to be exacerbated, tends to be increased or strengthened by the presence of other people. So if I'm a good pool player, then if there are other people around, then I'm going to be a better pool player. Whereas if I'm not a good pool player, the presence of other people watching me is actually going to make me play worse. We see that all different types of behaviors are influenced, even mundane behaviors. So one really cool study found that people in public restrooms tend to wash their hands more often when there are other people in the restroom with them. We tend to see that 91% of the time when another person is present, they wash their hands, but it drops all the way down to 45%. By the way, when you go to the bathroom, wash your hands. And we see that people tend to do things in crowds that they wouldn't otherwise do. And these behaviors are often influenced by social norms. These are standards of behavior that are established and enforced by different groups. These are somewhat unwritten rules or unwritten laws about what people should be doing in specific situations. These can be local social norms, so these can depend on the situation. So you might need to be quiet when you're in a library, but you don't need to be quiet when you're at a concert. Or these can be global, where these behaviors tend to be social norms, be socially acceptable in all situations, such as generally being polite to other people, or if you get a service, pay the person, and sometimes tip the person. That can apply to restaurants, coffee shops, etc., etc. Social norms can drive behaviors, and these aren't necessarily situations where people are trying to force you to behave in a certain way, like persuasion. Another example would be conformity. This would be situations where it might not necessarily be the case that individuals want you to behave in this way, but you are changing your behaviors in order to fit in with other people, in order to better reflect. It can sometimes be social norms, but it can sometimes be group norms. If we see someone, as the children in the Bobo doll study did, if we see someone punch one of these dolls, then when we're interacting with that doll, we're also going to want to punch it. If we see someone wearing skinny jeans, and it apparently is the trend, we're also going to wear skinny jeans. I would never wear skinny jeans, but that's beside the point. And in American society, in Western society, conformity especially tends to have a negative connotation. Oh, you're conforming with other people. Don't you have an individual thought in your body, etc., etc. But we only tend to associate negativity with conformity in individualistic cultures. Those cultures, like the United States, that emphasize autonomy and uniqueness. In other cultures, such as more Eastern cultures, conformity is a positive, and it's a positive because it works at what it's supposed to do. We don't conform because we're weak, we conform because we want to fit in. We want to do what other people are doing because other people are surviving and thriving in the world. We also want to survive and thrive. And there are different ways that we can be influenced by other people. We can focus on informational influence and normative influence. Informational influence is when you are trying to fit in with other people because you don't know what you're supposed to do. You're trying to get more information about a situation. We use informational influence a lot when we enter novel situations. We don't exactly know where we're supposed to stand, where we're supposed to look, etc. So we use this type of influence to behave in appropriate ways. Another type of influence that we can focus on is normative influence. This is when we behave in certain ways or we are influenced by others because we want to be liked by those people. We want to fit in. It's not because we need to get some kind of information about the situation. We might be well-versed, But we simply want to be liked. We simply want to make friends. We don't want to stand out in the crowd and be picked on. And another important distinction between these two types of influences is why we're behaving this way. With informational influence, we want to do what we're supposed to do. We want to learn from a situation, and we generally accept those behaviors as the ways you should behave. With normative influence, sometimes we behave in that manner not because we think it's the right thing to do, but because we're just trying to fit in. We might behave in ways that can go against what we actually believe. So an individual who's a huge Denver Broncos fan, for example, may show up to someone's Carolina Panthers man cave and talk about how the Panthers are good, but not actually believe that. That's an example of normative influence, but not informational influence. So hopefully all of you have looked through the slides and taken a look at the differences between Sharif's study and Ash's line studies. But you may take away kind of like, all right, we're doing studies on dots and lines. This is interesting, but it's a little bit silly. It doesn't really apply to the real world. Well, think about all the decisions that we can make in groups. We decide who, to a certain extent, lives or dies or goes to jail. Every company in the world makes decisions in groups. In these situations, we are influenced by other people in our groups. So it's very important to figure out, all right, how exactly are we influence others, and does that impact how we make very important decisions in the real world? Along with influence, we can also look at something called obedience. And this is generally when people perform an action in line with a direct order. We can think of chain of command, people giving out specific orders and the subordinates obeying what the superordinate individual or the manager, so to speak, is telling them to do. And obedience is extremely helpful for having a very efficient and effective organization. There are generally norms of obedience. People don't normally question authority unless they have a reason to. And people don't normally question experts unless there's a reason to. It's a lot easier to stay happy and naive and not try to question things. And people generally have this tendency to obey what other people are telling them to do. A great example of this is the Milgram obedience studies, which most of you are probably very familiar with, where people obeyed an experimenter's orders to shock another participant, electric shock another participant for answering incorrect questions, even though the shocks that they were delivering were apparently lethal doses. And 65% of people followed through with the lethal dose. Very surprising. You wouldn't necessarily expect that you, as an individual, would go to those lengths, but studies showed that you might and probably would. Another example of this is the Stanford prison experiment, where participants were randomly assigned to be prison guards or prison inmates. And the researchers found that the inmates were obedient to the guards, even though this was just kind of a make-believe situation. That obedience was real. Guards were really delving out punishment, and the inmates were taking it. So what fuels obedience? Why are we obeying people? And are there certain situations where we are less likely to obey? If we have the Milgram studies, how can we stop people from delivering lethal doses of electric shock to individuals? Well, there are certain aspects to obedience that make it more likely. So, for example, if the authority seems legitimate, we're more likely to obey. So if a person is wearing a white lab coat, we're more likely to obey a request that they have than an individual who's not wearing a lab coat. One particularly troubling example is that nurses who were told to give a lethal dose of medication to an individual by someone who was just simply wearing a lab coat followed through with the orders. They actually had to be stopped by the experimenters before they delivered the dose, simply because someone said that they were a doctor. What about some other reasons? Well, people are more likely to obey orders if everyone else is doing it. People are more likely to obey orders if the orders are given by someone who is extremely physically close to them. People are more likely to obey orders if the person that they might be delivering punishment to is further away, so they have more physical and psychological distance from the person who they're punishing. And people are more likely to obey orders if the orders come in incremental doses. So we talked about Milgram. People started at mild shocks and ended with a lethal dose. We can think about other more real-world applicable examples of kind of incremental orders. If we think about the soldiers during Nazi Germany during World War II, Think about some of the atrocities that some of these people carried out. Well, it didn't start with people basically mass murdering others. It started with these basic orders and escalated into something very, very horrible. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.